Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. We're doing our first 500-year series in the history of Christianity. Make sure you subscribe to our channel.
Yeah, and tap that bell to get notifications on new episodes.
Yep. And so in this episode, we're kind of excited because we're, in a way, retracing our steps when we were...
We didn't know it at the time, but this was our entrance into that journey back into Catholicism.
Yeah. It's really our own journey of encountering the first voices outside of the New Testament, the first voices that come after the apostles' deaths, and so you're the anticipation sort of killing you as a Protestant because you're like, I really do wonder.
Yeah, you've gone through the New Testament, you read all Paul's letters, you've done all that studying, and then it's like, okay, I got to take this next step outside of the New Testament. It's a little scary, and you're not sure what you're going to find.
Yeah. And so, you find Clement of Rome, and I would say for Protestants, that's a very comfortable place to be. I don't think Clement of Rome really presents too many problems, maybe some of the ritual and liturgy stuff, but really the figure we're going to focus on in this episode is Ignatius of Antioch. And I think that is probably the most troublesome figure. I'm not saying this from the outside, as an insider, as someone who was a Protestant encountering Ignatius of Antioch for the first time. I was very much troubled by him, so much so that you try to look for scholars who doubt his authenticity, the authenticity of his writings, which at this point, at one time that was in vogue, but at this point has now been pretty much put to bed.
So in this episode, we're going to use kind of Ignatius of Antioch as kind of that doorway into the idea of the great church.
Yeah.
And we're going to defend the idea of a great church. And so what do we mean by great church?
Yeah. So the Grosse Kirche in German scholarship is the idea is that there is a mainstream body organization called the church.
Network, broad, united network.
Yeah, that you can trace the history of and its growth and its development and its changes over time. And you can trace it from this very early time. So we're going to defend that idea.
We're going to defend that idea, yeah, because typically, two ways scholars would look at it. Some scholars who continue to defend the great church in its early stages would say it doesn't really start to show up until the mid-late 2nd century.
Yeah.
That's when you can really say, hey, there's a mainstream church going on in the Mediterranean world. The other end of it, and this was in vogue in the 20th century, was to say that the church begins in diversity, that there's all these different ecclesial communions going on in the early church, and then a great church emerges and kind of supplants and suppresses other Christianities.
Yeah.
So what we're saying is almost the exact opposite.
Right.
That the church begins in a broad unity across the Mediterranean in a great network, and that the schisms and diversities start to come actually later down the road.
But first things first, so let's talk about Ignatius of Antioch. I'm sure there's listeners to our podcast who aren't familiar with him. There's others who are, but for those who are not, let's just talk about who he is, why he's significant, what the story is of his writings, where do his writings come from, why do they emerge, why did he write them. So first, he's the Bishop of Antioch.
Yeah,
right?
He's the Bishop of Antioch in Syria, so the Eastern Mediterranean world. And he's writing his letters in year 107, probably is when we can date them to. But he's on his way, though, from Syria all the way to Rome because he's been arrested. We're not really quite sure on what charge, except that he's a Christian.
Yeah.
And the Romans have him in chains, and they're basically parading him through Asia Minor on the trek all the way to Rome.
And we can't forget that there is already a tradition of persecuting Christians that is happening. It's sporadic, but it's still happening. Sure. So you had the Neronian persecutions that got Peter and Paul, but you also had John. Remember that John was exiled to the island of Patmos, and when we say exiled to the island of Patmos, that doesn't mean he went on. He went to a resort. He was going to the salt mines. I mean, Patmos is a salt mining island. So he's working in the salt mines as an old man. It was like a death sentence. So there was
Emperor Domitian hunts down family members of Jesus. In fact,
yes.
So there's different emperors, different times throughout the early history of the church that there's these sporadic persecutions that are taking place. This happens to be one of them.
Yeah, and Ignatius gets caught up in this. So as he's traveling across Turkey and he's on his way to Rome to really be thrown to wild beasts in the arena, churches send delegates to meet him along the way. And the reason that they're doing that is because the churches would send these delegates who are really like scribes, and Ignatius would dictate a letter through them, and they would write it and then take it back to their church, sort of like his last will and testament.
So this is part of why Saint Ignatius is so important, because he didn't leave us a treatise.
Yeah.
He didn't leave us some grand apology for Christianity. He left us letters.
Yeah.
Letters are so important at this time because they're giving us not abstract ideas about the faith. They're giving us on the ground, boots on the ground kind of information of what the church looked like, how it acted, what it believed. All these different things are happening in Ignatius' letters, and we have 7 of them.
Yeah.
Very, very important.
Yeah. And it's great because in letter form, just like with St. Paul, you get to see the heart of the man. You get to see what he's worried about, what he's concerned about. And so, yes, you get a picture really of what's going on in the church. Not so much, what is the church believing about, all these different ideas. It's not you're right. It's not an idea venture. It's very much, here's my heart.
Well, it's pastoral.
Yes.
And that's what historians love to see that, because now we're getting at the root of certain things. So he's important and significant because he's very early, year 107, and he's been bishop for probably many years before that. So we're back into the 1st century, even with Ignatius. He's a man of letters, so he gives us great information. He's also doing all of this in a very, very popular area where we know all of the apostles worked.
Yeah.
He's even writing letters to specific churches, like the churches of Revelation, the churches that we know where St. John was active. St. Ignatius, just 10 years later, is writing letters to these same exact churches.
Yeah. It is really magnificent when you think about it, because even recently there was a manuscript discovered of the Gospel of John, and it's the earliest manuscript that we have of any New Testament writing. It's a fragment that comes from Egypt, and it dates to 120. So it's like you just see right there, like this is so early. This is when the Gospel of John has just been written. Like John was just there. Ignatius was a hearer of
Ignatius
John.
Ignatius is so early that, and I think we've mentioned this before, he doesn't quote exactly a lot of the Gospels. You can tell he's just living and breathing it.
The apostles' teaching.
Yeah, the apostles' teaching. That's how early St. Ignatius is.
Yeah. And the churches that are coming to meet him and that he's writing letters to, these are very, just to keep in mind, so that we're following the themes of our previous episodes, these are in Peter's territory. This is Peter's territory. This is Pontus, Bithynia, Galatia. This is Peterland.
Modern day Turkey and Syria. Yeah.
And then of course Rome. And we'll draw out why that's important, but keep that in mind as we go through. Yeah. But what are let's go through some of the main themes of Ignatius. Like if I'm just getting my feet wet in the early church and I'm just picking up Ignatius, what can I expect to see thematically throughout his 7 letters?
Well, if you're Protestant, run away. Don't read it. Because I remember, my first thesis in grad school was really on Ignatius. Yeah. I had to wrestle with Ignatius because some of the major themes in Ignatius are Eucharist theology, ecclesiology, the episcopate, bishop. It's astounding how many times he's talking about the bishop.
I think actually just in 7 letters, I think he actually mentions about 20 times he mentions obedience to the bishop and a single bishop.
So you kind of have the development of the monoepiscopate is what we would call that. The idea that there's one bishop over, even if there's many house churches in a city, there's still one bishop,
premier figure,
over perhaps multitude of little churches, house units or whatever it is. So those are 2 really big themes in.
And I wouldn't say it's not just the bishop. It's the threefold hierarchy itself. You see bishop, presbyter, deacon. And that's really important.
And a lot of times, especially a low church Protestant coming to it, maybe not an Anglican or anything, but a low church Protestant coming to it, they say, "Oh, this comes out of left field." Okay, this is where the church kind of maybe goes off, right? Look how he's talking about the Eucharist here. That's the flesh and blood of Jesus. Or, look how he's referring to the single bishop. That kind of sounds Catholic or Orthodox or something like that.
He uses the word Catholic.
He uses the word Catholic for the
first time that we see
to describe the church.
Yeah, it describes as a Catholic church. I would also say kind of a glorying and a mystical, sacramental view of martyrdom we kind of get from Ignatius too. We're going to get that too from the martyrdom of Polycarp. But this is kind of the first time where we see very gritty, like kind of gory,
a desire,
a
to
yearning,
die.
a yearning to just be martyred, and he sees himself as the bread of God, and
I don't know why that was, but I remember back, when we were Protestant, I do remember reading that and thinking, oh, that's tacky. That's I don't like that he's so yearning for martyrdom and
what's wrong with this guy?
Yeah, and I don't know why that. As a Protestant, that struck me as wrong or something, but it just did.
I think it's because it just sort of, in a way, you get scared of the direction it's going towards the cult of the saints or something.
Maybe,
you can sort of stop 10 steps ahead and say, "Stop there, don't go there."
Yeah, maybe.
But Ignatius, you get all these themes. But not just himself being a bishop, but you start to see that he's talking to congregations, and those congregations very clearly have a single bishop. So that's one thing I want to emphasize. I don't want people to think that like Ignatius is the only guy who claims to be a bishop, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a good point. And it's not like he's talking to another church that's like a mile away, and they have another senior pastor.
Yeah,
he's speaking to churches that are across the Mediterranean. So, if you think about the placement of where he is, he's in Syria, in Antioch. And let's say he's writing to Rome or to Ephesus even. Ephesus is on the whole other side of Asia Minor. Okay? So he's actually probably closer to Jerusalem than he is to Ephesus when he's writing. And so this is a broad area. These are two different Roman provinces here, where he's speaking from one bishop to another in the cities.
Yeah, and I think another reason why the letters of Ignatius can bother you as a Protestant is actually not what he says, but what he doesn't talk about. Justification. He doesn't mention it one time. Doesn't talk about it. And as a Protestant, you sort of have the justification like lenses on for every text that you read, and that's all you're looking for.
He mentions justification, but he doesn't speak of it in the way like St. Paul would.
Yeah, he's not giving a discussion of justification, which a Protestant is like, why isn't he talking? Where's the gospel in all of this? I could hear like a Baptistic Protestant thinking like that, like, well, where's the gospel in all of this? Whereas it's like he's living and breathing it, but yeah, he doesn't talk about that stuff. That's not his concern. So it also kind of makes you wonder. In 7 letters, he doesn't really talk about justification. That's another thing that hit me, at least. I was like, if justification is such a primary, like the most important thing that Christians can talk about, how could this man not even talk about it? Again, it's all part of this thing where like what he says and what he doesn't say sort of concerns you as a Protestant. Now, what I would say is that the reason that this is the case, that Ignatius sort of feels like he comes out of left field for both secular scholars and for Protestants, is because they bought into bad assumptions before they came to him. So they're disappointed when they see Ignatius because, I would argue, well, you spent reading the 27 letters or 27 books of the New Testament wrong. Like you read those incorrectly, and that's the reason why you feel like, well, where did this come from in Ignatius? But if you're watching our channel, like for instance, like the single bishop thing, it's like we talked about in Jerusalem, like. And Protestants love James. They love like James being this like central figure of the Jerusalem church.
Because it's kind of they can butt it up against Peter, right?
Yeah.
No, James and the Jerusalem church, that was the first church. Like St. Paul says that Jerusalem is our mother, right?
Yeah.
So they would like to bring that up, and we did when we were Protestants in our arguments too. But the idea of like a single leading figure of a community, James was certainly that in the first century church.
Yeah, exactly. And we said that when Peter is going around Pontus, Bithynia, Galatia, he's taking with him that view because again, he sees the ingathering of Christians as the temple. So it's organized like a temple. Whereas like we said with Paul, he's coming from Tarsus. His daily experience of his Judaism is the synagogue. So it's more likely that he's kind of ordering the church like a synagogue, whereas Peter is much more willing to do it like the church in Jerusalem.
High priests and then priests.
Yeah, and the Sanhedrin. The other thing is that Protestants are always balking at the means of Ignatius's arguments, but they're like missing the forest for the trees, because for instance, when Ignatius is talking about the Eucharist, this is one part where they're like, oh my gosh, because he'll say very clearly that like the Eucharist is the flesh, the flesh of Jesus Christ, and like, whoa, whatever. But even though they would like balk at the means of the argument, what he's actually arguing for is that Jesus became a real human being, because there's people running around who are saying that Jesus didn't actually come in the flesh.
So what you're saying, what you're saying is, if you're a Protestant coming to Ignatius, you have to make a decision. Either you have to agree with Ignatius when he says that the Eucharist is the flesh and blood of Jesus, or you have to agree with his detractors who are saying that Jesus was not a human.
Right. So
you have to pick one of those two.
Yeah.
What camp do you want to be in?
You're sort of repulsed by the idea of the Eucharist being Jesus' flesh, but you only have two choices here, and Ignatius is arguing that Jesus really became a man. So Ignatius is actually arguing for your orthodoxy through the Eucharist, and you don't like the means, but the conclusion is exactly what you believe.
Well, this is why I was always wondering why scholars dated him so early. I felt coming to his texts that this couldn't have been written in 107. It just couldn't have been. This has got to be late second, maybe even third century kind of stuff. But that's just not the case.
Yeah. And on the threefold hierarchy piece, so scholars, same thing. They assume that the church, because again they're reading the New Testament with a certain preoccupations, like certain presumptions,
just a certain lens. Yeah.
So I would argue, they missed the threefold hierarchy of why we have a bishop, presbyter, deacon by the time we get to Ignatius of Antioch. And it's actually one of those things that was like kind of right under your nose the entire time, but you just weren't seeing it. But Archbishop Michael Ramsey does a great job of this in his landmark book, The Gospel in the Catholic Church.
Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yeah, Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury. He wrote The Gospel in the Catholic Church. But he's dead right on this. He said the threefold hierarchy is on every page in the New Testament.
So
if you go to the New Testament and you're looking for bishop, presbyter, deacon, it's going to be tough. But that's not what you should be looking for.
Right.
So what you should be looking for is apostle, presbyterate, diaconate, the apostolate. Because what ends up happening is that these kind of proto-presbyters, these apostolic men, the men who follow the apostles, once the apostles die out, the function of the apostolate, that office, continues. And these men, these proto-presbyters, step into that function in the body of Christ. And so then, and it allows them to kind of have liberty with their jurisdiction. It's the reason why we can see people like Clement of Rome, for instance, writing to the Corinthians to correct them. Right?
Yeah. So for the non-episcopal kind of Protestant communions, they would see it as, well, once the apostles go away, you just have a plurality of leadership. You have elders.
Just presbyters and deacons.
Right. Yeah. What the lowercase c Catholic Church is saying is that function doesn't disappear. It doesn't go away.
It's a charism. Yeah.
It evolves into the episcopate.
Yeah.
And presbyters rise up to take the position of the apostles,
yeah,
which is exactly what we hear from St. Irenaeus late in the 2nd century.
Well, actually, even before that, we hear it in the book of Acts, right? Like, let another man take his office.
Come on, man, don't do that to me. No, St. Irenaeus.
And it's important to note that we're not just talking about the 12 apostles. There were many apostles. Remember that Jesus sends out the 70. I mean, those 70 people are still there,
Technically, anybody who witnessed Jesus in the flesh and was commissioned by Jesus.
And the function of the apostolate was, again, to, like, for instance, when Paul goes and visits Corinth, when he goes and visits Jerusalem, when he goes and visits wherever, he has immediate jurisdiction when he goes because he's an apostle. When Peter goes somewhere, he has immediate jurisdiction when he steps into that church because he's an apostle and these are just presbyters. Yeah. Well, again, we're going to see that same function step in, and it resolves disputes. So yeah, it's staring at us in the face on the pages of the New Testament, and if you weren't paying attention to that, that's why when you come to Ignatius, you're like, what is this about?
What's all this bishop stuff about?
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, so getting into like the meat then of kind of our argument for this position of the great church, the existence of the great church. Let's start there. So point number 1.
Yeah, I would start with the idea scholars refer to as translocal consciousness. What does that mean? The early church. And help me out if I want to get it right, that the early church understood itself to be part of a broad network that was in communion with one another, right from the get-go.
I don't think it's wrong to say organization. Like they literally see themselves.
Yeah, organization, organism, whatever, however you want to say it. But right from the get-go, it's very clear from like the letters of Ignatius that they're always thinking about the whole church. The the whole church. And I can remember our days, in the Bible church we started out in, how isolated you felt.
Yeah.
We'd always say, hey, we should do more with the other churches in our neighborhood, or that kind of stuff. It was sad. I mean, you did feel isolated, and you kind of stayed within your
bubble.
You stayed in your bubble. Well, we're here to tell you that's not the take from the early church. That's
Right.
not how they viewed the church.
Yeah.
They view themselves as not only connected across the Mediterranean, but also even within a city itself, that they're connected to each other within the city.
Yeah.
And so they're always thinking of something larger than themselves, outside of themselves. That's how the early church saw the church.
Well, and their connection point from city to city was the bishop. That's what we see. It's division at this point doesn't mean rival, churches. It means you're doing things without the bishop. The bishop. There's just one bishop. Like, it's unthinkable in Ignatius. When you're reading Ignatius, it's unthinkable that there would be another bishop.
Yeah.
In the city.
That's right. And really, so you got to think again practical about this. Like, think about how Christianity is spreading. It's an urban phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's not something that's going on in the countryside. It's concentrated in the cities. And, you look at a lot of good scholars who do some of this work on how large were these communities, Some of the larger cities like in Ephesus or in Antioch, you're looking at maybe 10 to 12 house unit churches or apartments or whatever space they're renting. Maybe you have 30 to 40 members in one of those house churches. So total 400, 500 Christians in a city, 1,000, maybe 2,000 at the most in larger cities. That's not a lot of people.
It's not.
And so even the idea, even the fact that Christianity began as an urban movement promoted koinonia, promoted communion, because you didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
They knew each other. They knew who they were. There was only a few hundred of them in each of these cities, and you couldn't trick somebody and say, well, I'm from the apostles. They'd be like, well, no, because the guy my grandfather has been in the congregation since year 75, and so you couldn't trick somebody as easily in the earliest church.
Yeah.
When it came
It's too young.
It's too young. When it came to where did you come from, the answer was easy.
Yeah. Like today, separated by so many generations from this early period of the church, it's much more difficult to prove that you are the church that traces itself back to the apostles. But back then, it's so young and new. Like, we know, Ignatius was a hearer of John. What are you talking about?
Right.
It was easy to refute people who were trying to move people away from the bishops. You could head them off at the pass. The other thing is that with scholars, they assume that Christianity starts in each city with sectarianism, like you said, and then slowly there's a consolidation of power that happens. Boy, don't you just hear, by the way, the Marxist dialectic there of like all these vying groups in society, these sects, and then it's a power struggle, and then one emerges victorious, right?
It's all about power. It's all
about power struggles. Yeah. So boy, how convenient that the 20th century scholarship would write the history of the church that way as well. And again, it's upsetting because it's actually the complete opposite. Sectarianism, this is the problem. Sectarianism presupposes high populations, high numbers. But we don't have that yet. Just like you said, we have a few hundred people in each city. You don't have the luxury of starting schisms and sects.
Yeah.
It's like if you're a Christian and you maybe have some alternative ideas in your head, you're not going to be like, well, I'm going to go off by myself when it's dangerous, number one, also to kind of be a Christian at this time. Like, I'm going to go start a new sect myself with a rival bishop. It's like, no, you're just gathering with the people with the bishop,
Let's give it. Do you have the Ephesians open?
Yeah.
So let's give an example of what we're talking about when we say translocal consciousness.
Right. And this is one example of how basically they saw in the bishop the representative of the universal church in that city. Like it's through the bishop that I see the church in that city.
The bishop is in the church, and the church is in the bishop.
Right.
Yep.
So
I had Ephesians 1:2 down. If I don't know which one you wanted to read, but
let's do Ephesians. So Ephesians 1, I'll do 1:3 because he's just talking about coming through wild beasts in Rome. So he says they send to him basically their bishop. So he says to them, "Since therefore I have received in God's name your whole congregation in the person of Onesimus, a man of inexpressible love, who is also your earthly bishop, I pray that you will love him in accordance with the standards set by Jesus Christ, and that all of you will be like him. For blessed is the one who has graciously allowed you, worthy as you are, to have such a bishop. Now that's the bishop. So you can see that they mutually recognize each other's clergy already. But
across, again, from Syria all the way to Ephesus, on the other corner of Asia Minor.
Chapter 2 of Ephesians then just goes down the list of all these other representatives from the other churches. So he says Onesimus, Burrus, Euplus, Fronto. So he's saying all these people that you
there's like 5 or
sent.
6 delegates, which, like you said, could be the scribes, whatever. But also, it's showing you that very possibly that there are multiple little groupings within the city of Ephesus. For example, a house church here, and an apartment church here, whatever it is, and they too are sending delegates to go meet Ignatius, who's the bishop on the other side of the Mediterranean. So there's that network that we're talking about that is very important. This is apostolic tradition.
Yeah.
It's apostolic tradition, and it's Christian tradition to be a religion of letters and to be a religion of human contact.
Yeah.
That we keep in contact with one another. We send delegates to each other, right? Think of our Jerusalem Council episode. What did the council decide to do? Draft the decision and send it out in the diaspora. Send it out throughout the Mediterranean so that everybody gets it. That tradition of St. Paul writing letters to everybody continues with the bishops in Ignatius's day. They're writing letters to each other. They're sending delegates back and forth to each other. They're staying in communion.
Yeah. And
that's apostolic tradition.
It's important in his letter to Smyrna, chapter 8, verse 2, he says there, this is when he uses the word Catholic for the first time to describe the church. And by Catholic, of course, we hear that as like Catholic versus heretical.
Denominationally.
Yeah, like denominationally. That's not how he means it. He means it more as, universal as opposed to peculiar and particular and local. So he sees that there's like, no, like the broad practice of Christianity. That's what you should be doing. What is everybody doing? And in that you can kind of hear too. Remember that the church, fairly recently came out of the whole controversy over like Jews, Gentiles, circumcision, and this stuff. So now that there's like a Jew-Gentile, the barrier has been broken down. There's a Jew-Gentile unity in the church. It's like not just what's going on in Judea, but universally what's going on across the Mediterranean in the church. What we're all believing and doing. That's the universal church, and every bishop in the city is a bishop of that universal church.
Yep.
So that's, again, that translocal consciousness. It's proof of it, at least, because he sees every local bishop as a universal representative.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
The other thing is that, if we step back from Ignatius for a second, just in general, if we do a broad sweep of the early to the mid-2nd century, Clement, like we said, he has no problem writing a letter to
St. Clement
church.
of Rome, mid-90s, writes a letter in the name of Rome to Corinth to solve a leadership issue.
Yeah.
All the way over in Greece.
Yeah.
And then a century later, we hear from the Corinthian bishop commending Rome for solving our issue so many decades ago. So thank you for that, basically. You know? So that's at the end of the 1st century that the Church of Rome is stepping in and solving an issue for the Corinthian church.
Yeah. Now, and then when you come to Ignatius, when Ignatius is on his journey to Rome, he's worried. And you see it in his letters. You see it in Ephesians, Magnesians, and Trallians. In these letters, he says every time, pray for Antioch. Pray for the church at Antioch, because there was arguings and bickering without him being there. Like, pray for them. Well, then when you come to the Philadelphian, his letter to the Philadelphians, and his letter to the Smyrnians, and then another to Polycarp himself, who is the bishop of Smyrna, he actually says, can you send some delegates to Antioch for me to congratulate them that they have made peace with one another? So again, it's like a sharing of clergy. It's like an organization. It's like, they're my employees too, in a way,
Yeah, and that's why. So there's a category that breaks down because a lot of Roman scholars, when they try to view how the early Christians grouped themselves, they typically point to what were called collegia. Little guilds in the cities. The problem with that is that those little collegia in the cities, those groupings of people who had the same kind of job or whatever it is, something that bound them together, that's not a good way to actually represent or to talk about the church, because collegia were city focused. The church is universally focused.
Yeah.
They're looking outside of themselves, outside of their collegia. So in other words, this is a new thing.
Yeah.
This is something different now that they received from the apostles.
Yeah. And remember that this all goes back to the primary confession that Jesus is Lord, like not Caesar. So they see themselves as a kingdom. They really do. They see themselves as a king, under a king and part of a kingdom.
Yeah.
Taking brands, you know. The other thing is that there's a unity that you see of ritual. And that's astounding in the second century, because again, you have to put yourself back here. There's no TV, there's no news, there's no email, there's no phones. It takes a long time for information to travel from one place to another. I mean, it would be so difficult if you were just imagine being a bishop of a city to find out what are they teaching in Rome, what are they teaching in Alexandria, what are they up to over there, so that when you write a letter to somebody, you have to be confident when you say certain things. You almost have to be confident that they're kind of on the same page as you. They're going to know what the heck you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's what we see in Ignatius. He makes these references to the Eucharist, to the ritual of the church, that again he would have to be assuming that you guys, because you guys do it too,
right? You practice it a certain way, like I do.
Yeah. He even uses like analogies, like he uses phrases like in Ephesians 5:1 he says you being mixed with God. Well, that's clearly a reference to the mixing of the cup, the water and the wine in the cup,
which is a very early tradition, the mixing of the cup.
Exactly. And then he says being full of God, with the bread. And that's in Magnesians 14:1. He has a long thing on Christ's anointing, and he said the fragrance of your anointing and all this in Ephesians 17:1. So he's referencing,
already assuming the matter of sacraments.
Yes,
in his letters,
and assuming that they're doing it too across provinces. Remember that, Antioch is a part of Syria, and then he's writing over to these churches in Asia Minor. It's a different province.
See, sometimes, particularly in Ignatius' letter to the Romans, a lot of people will say, see, Rome didn't have a bishop at the time or something like that, and this and that. And what's great about it is that it's clear that Ignatius kind of doesn't know the Roman church, but that makes it all the better.
Yeah.
Because he's still confident enough to write to the Church of Rome as the Bishop of Antioch. I think that's more evidence for what we're saying.
Yeah.
Is that, that's cool that Ignatius actually doesn't really know Rome because he's on the other side of the Mediterranean. But even he has the confidence enough, even though he's from the Eastern Empire, to write to Rome.
Yeah.
And assume belief and assume that they will want to take care of him. He does. He says to the Romans, don't try and save me.
Don't try to stop me from being martyred.
Right. Yeah. Don't try and stop me from martyrdom. Don't try and stop me on my way to heaven. Okay. So that to me is more astounding, that he has the confidence to write to Rome in that way.
Yeah. And we see this unity of rituals as well. We'll get there. We're going to talk about something called the Quartodeciman controversy when we get to the mid-2nd century. But what you find is during that controversy, Polycarp, who's one of Ignatius's interlocutors, he's one of his friends, he's the bishop of Smyrna. He has a letter not only to the Church of Smyrna, but he also has a letter to Polycarp personally. Polycarp, in his old age, to settle that controversy and to show the church that no, the Asiatic churches and the Roman church are not in conflict with one another. He goes to Rome, and it says that the bishop of Rome permits him to celebrate the Eucharist in Rome. So think about that. He would have to be confident enough to step into another church across the empire during their service, during their worship, and know exactly what he needed to do. So that unity of ritual is huge.
Well, and the examples keep going on, but I would also bring up St. Justin Martyr. So St. Justin Martyr is an Eastern ethnicity, is Eastern. But of course we know he was martyred in Rome and writing in Rome, and he was a Christian philosopher, and he well-traveled kind of man. Well, when he's writing to the Roman emperor to write a defense of Christianity, he's able to describe the worship of Christians in just a few paragraphs.
Yeah. Assuming that that's what everybody's doing.
That's what everybody does. And he would know because he's been all over the Mediterranean as a Christian philosopher. So again, there's this broad...
If the scholars were right, what would that have sounded like? It would have been like, well, we in Rome, we Christians in Rome are, we do this. In, elsewhere it's otherwise.
This way, it's otherwise, yeah.
But here, this is what we do. And when you see that, like, by the time you get to the end of the 2nd century, early 3rd century, we start to see these rituals written down, which means that they've already existed for quite some time. And they even claim that when they're writing it. They're like, yeah, this goes back to the apostles, So this unity of ritual, again, born in the traveling of these apostles from city to city, was maintained.
Yep.
And that's sort of, gave a brand to the great church tradition.
So that's the first defense, right?
Yeah.
So
Translocal consciousness.
Right? That there's this great network. The second point of defense for saying there was this great church from the beginning is you can tell from the earliest fathers, Ignatius especially, that when there were divisions amongst the communities, that they were of recent providence.
And internal.
That they literally just happened, that these are literally just offshoot happenings, and he's saying, you need to fix it. And he tells them how to fix it.
Yeah.
Okay? So you can read an example from his letter to the
Philadelphians.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in chapter 8, verse 1, he says, I was doing my part, therefore, as a man set on unity, but God does not dwell where there is division and anger. The Lord, however, forgives all who repent, if, in repenting, they return to the unity of God and the counsel of the bishop.
And that's pretty par for the course through his letters. He's constantly saying they need to return. They need to return.
Yeah. He's not saying like that they would stop their unbelief and come to the communion of the church, to come to the Christian thing. He's saying they went out and they need to get back over here. Yeah. So again, you're seeing that there was a unity. These people, and it's even in St. John, they went out from us, because they were not really of us. Yeah. So you can see that there's this prior unity that people are messing with. But even then, we're not seeing parallel hierarchies.
You're not seeing rival bishops.
No.
He doesn't. He would have mentioned rival bishops. He would have mentioned rival. You're not seeing that. You're seeing congregants who are withholding themselves for different reasons. And he's saying you need to get back with your bishop.
Yeah. Or they're being fancied by ideas. There's a lot of religious ideas in the marketplace in the ancient world, and there's Christians who are just interested in them.
And here's two things. So what Ignatius is assuming there is that division is not fundamental to the church.
Right.
And it's not final.
Yeah.
It's not decided. So when you look back at Ignatius' letters, say, well, look, there's divisions everywhere. There's different Christian communities everywhere. It's like, well, no, it's still they're still deciding the fate of these Christians, and it's just happened. It literally just happened.
Yeah.
And he's working to resolve it.
Yeah. Division at this point does not mean going off and starting another church with a parallel hierarchy. It just means there are Christians who are doing some things without the approval and the oversight of the bishop,
or thinking things,
even thinking that they can just go off and hold a Eucharist together without the bishop. He's like, whoa, whatever you do over there without the bishop isn't valid. That's what Ignatius is saying, and he's not saying it as though like he's creating this. He's saying it as like something that like, don't you know that?
Right.
Like this is what we've always known this. You're not supposed to do that. So division at this point is really just, you're not in harmony with your bishop. You're not in harmony with your bishop. That's key. It's still their bishop.
Yeah.
And that's why he's saying repenting is to return to your bishop.
Yeah.
So to him, the scandal is to not be with the bishop because it's not being with Jesus Christ.
Right.
Because only on the bishop's altar is Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So here's a good example from the letter to the Magnesians, St. Ignatius. That's a scandal that you're separating from the bishop. He says in chapter 4 of his letter to the Magnesians, it is right, therefore, that we not just be called Christians, but that we actually be Christians, unlike some who call a man bishop, but do everything without regard for him. Such people do not appear to me to act in good conscience, inasmuch as they do not validly meet together in accordance with the commandment. So what are you seeing there? You're seeing that they acknowledge that you are the Bishop Ignatius, but we're going to do our own thing.
Yeah.
So the separatists aren't setting up rival episcopate.
No. They know who the clergy are.
They know who the clergy are. They know they know what the church is, who she is. And that comes out clear in that example for.
Well, look, and at the end of the day, to put the cherry on top of the cake, it's that, are cherries on top of cakes? Does anyone do a cherry on top?
Frosting.
I've only seen on top of milkshakes. But Ignatius never in his letters mentions a single rival. That's astounding. If you had rivals and parallel, church structures and communions,
even just presbyters.
Yes.
Hey, don't go with those presbyters.
Yeah.
He didn't say that.
Yeah. Even then, they say too that whatever you do, don't do it without, he says, the bishop, or at least the presbyters that the bishop has approved to do what they're going to do. Mm-hmm. So even then, it's like there's no presbyters either, except the presbyters that are under the bishop.
Right.
There's no like rival presbyters, and then there's like only one bishop. It's all of it. There's no parallel hierarchy whatsoever.
Yeah.
These are just individual Christians going off and doing their little things, kind of forming little holy clubs together, and with their own thoughts. And that happens all the time, even like today. You can see it in like the life of a parish. You have like a troublesome group that gets together, and they have like kind of kooky ideas or something. That's kind of what's going on here.
Yeah. So one caveat to this is that, so what we're saying is that there's no rival communion. Okay. There's only one communion. There's no other communion that has a history and a future here. Okay. Mm-hmm. The one caveat to that is there is in existence Jewish Christians.
Oh yeah.
And Jewish Christian communities. Mm-hmm. Now, they may be few and far between, and we'll get into the Jewish Christianity. We'll get into that. So just note that's there. There are Jewish Christian communities. But even then, Ignatius still defines the church that he knows of, the main church, as already including Jews and Gentiles.
Right.
And so you get a great sense of this in his letter to Smyrna. Mm. So he says, Jesus, truly nailed in the flesh for us under Pontius Pilate and Herod the Tetrarch, in order that he was nailed to the cross, in order that he might raise a banner for the ages through his resurrection and for his holy ones, the faithful people, among the Jews and among the Gentiles, in one body of his church. There's that old Pauline language of one body still, Jews and Gentiles. It's clear that Ignatius knows that there's Jews within his congregations.
Yeah.
And then it goes on right in the very next chapter, and there's no chapter breaks in the ancient world.
Yeah.
So it's literally right after. He then goes on to say, "For I know and believe that he was in the flesh even after the resurrection. And when he came to Peter and those with him, he said to them, quote, 'Take hold of me, handle me, and see that I am not a disembodied demon,' end quote." What is he quoting there? Because that doesn't occur in the Gospels. Mm-hmm. It doesn't occur in St. Paul's letters. He's actually quoting the Gospel to the Hebrews, which is a Jewish Christian gospel from Egypt. So it's showing you that Ignatius includes within his tradition Jewish Christianity and Jewish Christians. How is it that he knows the Gospel of the Hebrews so well that he can just quote from it? Mm-hmm. He has it probably in his library.
Yeah.
Okay? So in other words, Jews are still very much a part of Ignatius' church. How else would he complain of Judaizers?
Yeah.
People who want to act like Jews and those types of things. That's happening still within the church that Ignatius is a bishop of.
Hence why it's so appropriate that he would use the word universal to describe the church that he's the bishop of, because he's saying that the apostles created a universal church, a church of Jew and Gentile, not just of little Jewish clubs.
Right.
This is meant for Jew and Gentile to have the dividing wall of hostility broken down and to come together to one altar with one bishop.
Again, the church, fundamentally, the church is not sectarian.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a unity.
Yeah. So the third point is how the Romans, right? How outsiders viewed the Christians kind of helps us get a window into how organized they were, sort of what their own conception was of themselves. So how did the Romans see them?
Well, I always found it really astounding that even in the first century, you mentioned the Neronian persecution. Emperor Nero persecutes the Christians in the 60s. Mm-hmm. How did he know who the Christians were at that point? How was he able to decipher who the Christians were? Well, that's because they were decipherable.
Yeah.
The Romans knew who the Christians were, and they knew who to go after and who to crucify. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they are a identifiable body even in the first century, a unified body.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. There is a Greek philosopher by the name of Celsus, writing in the 2nd century. He wrote a a treatise against Christians, against Christianity, in the 170s or so. And actually, he might have written it against Justin Martyr, is what scholars think. But anyway, he has this long treatise attacking Christianity, attacking Christians, everything that they're about. Oh, your gospels. How could you worship a God who's crucified and all these things? And the first people who saw your risen Lord were women, all this stuff, right?
These are silly female stories.
Silly female myths. Okay. So he's really going at it. But the one thing about Celsus is that you can tell he knows Christianity. And that tells you how well Christianity was able to infiltrate the elites.
Yeah.
Right? The educated people of the empire. We always think of Christianity as like, it's the religion of
lower
the poor.
classes or something.
No.
Yeah.
Celsus's knowledge of Christianity is also astounding. That he knows so much about the Gospels. He literally has read the Gospels. He knows them. But what's interesting is that Origen of Alexandria has preserved for us Celsus's treatise, parts of Celsus's treatise, because Origen then in the 3rd century writes against Celsus.
Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, Celsus, when he writes of the church to discredit it, he comes to the topic of, you have sects among you, you know. But it's clear that when Celsus is mentioning these sects, it's all the sects that we're already familiar with, that we already know. He mentions one main body,
the mainstream
church, and he says, but you have these other groups.
Yeah, but what are all these other guys too?
Valentinus, and then you have this group or that group, and primarily these other quote unquote Christianities that he's mentioning are all primarily Gnostic, which we know of already from Saint Irenaeus.
Yeah.
Okay. So what's the point of me saying that? Is that even Celsus, a Roman, a Greek philosopher, is viewing Christianity how traditional scholarship and traditional Christians viewed early Christianity. That there was a great church, there was a main body, and then there are these offshoots. So again, you have a choice to make if you're not Catholic or Orthodox. Your choice is either you agree with a main body, you agree with the church that's in communion with Irenaeus and Ignatius and St. Justin Martyr and Origen of Alexandria, or you agree with the Gnostics. Those are your choices. And those are the only choices that the outsiders even see. So they know.
Yeah.
There is no but what about that whole other communion of Christians that you don't agree with? That doesn't even occur.
Right.
Celsus could have very easily, his knowledge is so deep of Christianity, Celsus could have said, what about this bishop?
Yeah, which apostolic Christianity? You also have this Jewish community that's been there from the beginning.
Yeah.
Or you
what about those bishops over there? He doesn't say any of that.
Right.
He knows one main body and the Gnostics, primarily.
Kind of like that body that possesses these scriptures.
What's funny,
rightfully.
What's really funny about it, though, is that Origen then he goes back at Celsus. Celsus is dead by this time, but he goes back at Celsus and actually has to remind him of other sects that he forgot about. That, there's other Gnostic sects. Yeah. And he was speaking of Valentinus, right?
Yeah.
So it's actually Ignatius reminding him that there's other sects, but again, primarily Gnostic sects.
Yeah.
There aren't these other rival Christian communions. And that's, when you're Protestant, you're always looking for that.
Right.
It's like, where's that secret church that's supposed to be there?
And you're going to see, too, that when you come to Saint Cyprian of Carthage,
in the 3rd century,
when you actually have a schism, you have a parallel hierarchy that does finally form. You have the rigorists, the laxists, and the Catholics. Cyprian actually says in his treatise on the unity of the Catholic Church, he says, "For who could even conceive that there would be multiple bishops in a city?" It's literally inconceivable to him. And that's what we see in Ignatius. It's inconceivable to him that there would... It doesn't even come up for Ignatius. It's not even a thought.
And to piggyback on that, and that's why someone like St. Irenaeus in the late 2nd century can say to the Gnostics, where are your bishops? I don't see them. Here's my list. Do you have a list?
Right.
No, you don't. And so, that's the whole point. And you would know this because you studied the Montanists. The Montanist church. You can actually say there was a Montanist church.
Yeah.
Right? You can say that in the late 2nd and early 3rd century.
Yeah. It starts off as a holy club within the church, but the minute that people were like, what's going on with these people? What are you doing? And then eventually they go off, they start
do
their
have
own
their
hierarchies.
rival presbyters, their rival bishops, all that. But again, the point is that they came from the mother.
Exactly.
They're
So there was a
offshoots from the
prior
mother.
unity that existed, and that is presupposed.
Yeah.
So that's why when scholars are coming to Ignatius, they're sort of thrown off because the tale that they were telling even throughout the New Testament is plurality. There's a plurality of traditions and communities and all these different things. And then they come to Ignatius like, what the heck is this?
Yeah.
Well, it's like because you read all the prior stuff wrong. You set yourself up to fail when you came to Ignatius.
Yeah, it's not that the church is independent and kind of loosely affiliated. It's that the churches are dependent and highly affiliated with each other from the beginning.
Yeah. And they're not just sharing hierarchies, not just sharing this, but even down to their money, to the way that they care for the poor in their city and they become a harbor for the poor. They're sharing money across cities. You don't do that unless you're of the same organization or of the same structure. You don't really see that, in anything else. There's no like, and then there was this rival group that was sending money over to these. You don't see any of that. It just doesn't exist.
Where's the history? Where's the future? If those communities existed, where are their documents?
Yeah.
Because you know what? Because somebody might say, well, the church got rid of it. They burned them, or they suppressed them, or they supplanted them.
History Channel.
But it's like, but we have all the Gnostic documents. They've all been found and preserved.
Yeah.
So where's this kind of secret Christianity that's supposed to be there?
And for those people who aren't familiar with like the scholarship on this, like that's what scholars kind of do. They kind of create communities.
Yeah.
Like the
every document that exists is another community.
A new document that forms like, so this was a Christian community that believed this and the other thing. So that brings us to our fourth point actually, because the fourth proof of this is actually Ignatius himself. And the thing that what he represents, and the things that he's swimming in, right? Because the documents, for instance.
So scholars will like to say that, okay, hey, we have this document over here, and it kind of has a unique perspective on Jesus or a unique Christology.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we have this document over here, and it's a little different than that one. And so what they like to do is say, well, that must represent a different kind of Christianity, a different group. Ignatius himself shows and defends the idea of the existence of a great church, because his letters are so theologically deep and diverse. He's pulling from all kinds of different scriptures, different writings, different traditions, all in himself. So like we said earlier, the example of the Gospel of the Hebrews. That's not in our canon, but St. Ignatius is quoting it
was in his canon.
As scripture, as in his canon. Right? He is diverse in his thought. And he very much writes and exhorts like St. Paul. He thinks very much like St. John, and he acts like a St. Peter. You can tell that he's assuming in himself this grand, great tradition. And so when I look at Ignatius and I see a lot of diversity in thought and perspective, but it's all in one man and in one church that he represents.
Yeah. So to put that simply, it would be to say, look, if what the scholars are saying is true, you would expect then that Ignatius would only be quoting from let's say the four Gospels, the ones that we know, and then that's why the discovery of the Gospel of the Hebrews or the Gospel whatever, all these different Gospels.
Been a different.
So these are those separate communities that were suppressed by this emergent Catholic Church. But see, the problem, like you said, with that is that those are Ignatius's documents too. He doesn't have a problem quoting the Gospel of the Hebrews. He doesn't have a problem quoting these other variant texts that eventually do not make it into the canon, or just get lost, just plain old lost. I mean, there's even the writings of Papias, like if you go back and look at his the sayings of Christ, that are preserved through Eusebius. These are weird sayings that we've never heard before. But again, it was part of his tradition to speak them, and he was the bishop of Hierapolis. He's part of this mainstream great church tradition, and yet he's quoting all these things that we don't even know what he's quoting from. So it just shows you that the church in its textual tradition at this time is very diverse at this time. So there's not rival communities every time a new text crops up. They know of these texts. They're their texts. These are our texts in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And the other point to tag along here is that, and there's some good scholars that have said this, if there was this great diversity in the earliest church at the turn of the century, where'd it go? Why did it evaporate so soon? Because most of scholarship says that by the time you come to the mid to late 2nd century, there is this grand church. Well, how is it that in 20 or 30 years, all these rival Christianities just disappeared?
Yeah.
Right? So if you're going to argue that, it's an argument from silence.
Yeah. Like you said, where's its history? Where's its future?
Yeah. And so that's why, I've said this before, even in our personal journey. It's always more important to be not in agreement with one father or another, but to be in communion with them. Mm-hmm. It's not so much important for me to agree with St. Ignatius on everything he says. It's more important for me to be in communion with him.
Mm-hmm. To be at the bishop's altar.
To be at the bishop's altar. Mm-hmm. To know that my bishop was with the bishop before him and the one before all the way down.
Yeah. And let me just put a caveat to that before we get a bunch of hate mail from the traditionalist end. We're not saying that
snail mail, but emails.
We're not saying don't agree with what the Catholic Church teaches today. Just go to the bishop's altar. We're not saying that. What we're saying is that you agree with the teachings of the church contra certain fathers, because sometimes the fathers, the church has judged in the past that certain fathers were not right 100% of the time. In fact, all of them have some points of doctrine where they were not correct
or not fully developed.
Mm-hmm. Or not developed, exactly. Yeah. So that's what you're saying, is that I can go back and I can say, for instance, with Saint Cyprian, right, that rebaptizing people who've already been baptized in the name of the Trinity apart from the Catholic Church, like he would say that no, you have to rebaptize them. But the church has decided at this point that no, you don't. It's a valid baptism. Mm-hmm. So I can disagree with Cyprian and still be in communion with him because I'm at the bishop's altar.
And that was St. Augustine's point when he was arguing that he was in communion with Cyprian's church. So even though St. Augustine, over a century later, is saying, well, yeah, Cyprian would have disagreed with me, but guess what? I'm sitting in the same seat.
Exactly.
I'm sitting in the chair, the bishop's throne, that's in communion with his throne.
It's the continuity of this body, this organism over time, through the succession of the bishops and the sacraments and the altar that makes this great church a true living reality, historical reality. Mm-hmm.